and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Comics. Today, I am joined by the one, the only Si Spurrier, one of the smartest, most inventive writers working in comics today. You've seen his name on books like X-Men and Hellblazer and a bunch of other work-for-hire book, but it's his creator-owned stuff. Stuff like Coda, Spire, Step by Bloody Step. Those are the books where Si really cuts loose. And his latest, The Voice Said Kill, might be the wildest one yet. That one is out in July. Depending on when you're listening to this, it may be out already. We're going to do a lot in this one. We talk about the shift from doing work-for-hire stuff to creator-owned stuff, and how much, harder and or more rewarding it is to make something that is fully yours. We dig into the craft side of things too. I know you guys love that stuff. Everything from how he builds worlds to how he chooses who he works with and collaborators. And we get into what happens when an artist delivers something so good, it forces you to rewrite the script. I wanted to spend some time talking about Step by Bloody Step, because that is a book that, if you have not read that book, stop what you're doing right now. Pause this, go to the bookshop, go to your local comic book store, and just pick it up. It is an experience unlike anything else. This is a silent book that somehow hits louder than most comics with words. So we get into how working on that book not necessarily changed his process kind of moving forward, but what insight it gave to his process and how he takes that into account with new projects that he's worked on since. And then, of course, we talk about The Voice Said Kill, his latest from Image Comics, a psychedelic swamp noir set deep in Louisiana bayou. I'm going to leave that one in because this intro so far has been top notch. It's about a pregnant park ranger, a dangerous man with a gun, an alligator poaching crime family, and the kind of decision that spirals everything out of control. Working with Vanessa Del Rey, the artist on the book, his collaborator on the book, you feel the sweat. You feel the tension. And it's loaded with all of the weird, smart character work that if you've read Si's stuff, he's really, really good at. So, if you care about storytelling, collaboration, or just want to look at how something truly original gets made, this podcast shows you how the sausage gets made. This episode is for you. But first, after you go buy Step by Bloody Step, come back, listen to the rest of the intro, pause again, take a screenshot. Well, don't pause yet. Take a screenshot of this episode that you're listening to, or any episode that you've listened to. Share it on social. Tag us on Instagram. Tag us on Twitter. Tag us on Blue Sky. Tag Image. Tag me. Tag whoever you want. Tag the creators. Let them know you're listening to this show. It's one of the greatest ways to get the word out about the show. A lot of you have left some really, really great reviews, and so I definitely want to read some of those. Those will be at the end. So if you've left a review recently, stick around to the end. Don't fast forward to the end. Stick around to the end, because this is a fun one. Si and I worked with Si when I was at Marvel. I don't think I've ever kind of met him in person. We exchanged a lot of emails, and so let's see if he remembers me. We'll see. All right, if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's talk comics. Si, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. You're very, very kind. Very kind words. Of course I remember you. I bet it was so one of those under that bridge since then. I mean, do you look back on those days fondly, or do you have a little trauma twitch when you think back to that?
It's a little bit of both, right? Like here's the thing I love about it. Everyone that I worked with, creator-wise, back when I was there, is now doing really cool shit at Image, right?
It's your fault.
And so the stuff that I did with them back at Marvel like was fine and fun and whatever, but like the stuff that we get to do now here, things like this,
Mm-hmm.
means more, right? And like I like means more to you guys, obviously, because these are your creator-owned babies,
Yeah.
and there's so much more. Uh, you're putting yourselves out there so much more than necessarily some of the work for hire stuff, and so
It's such a different mentality, and you know it's
yeah, well,
people.
so I'd love to let's start there. I'd love to talk about that because you've done a lot of work in both
Mm-hmm.
areas. How do you switch in and out? And more if anything, I have to imagine with the creator with the work for hire stuff. Obviously, there's a decent amount of planning and things that kind of go into it, but you are on a more mandated kind of due date timeline than necessarily you would be on your creator owned stuff that gives you more time to live in it and think about it. So yeah, let's talk about it. How do you switch kind of in and out, and what's it like for you to have to do that?
I mean, it's fantastically difficult, I suppose, is the short answer. It's really funny. Like, I mean, I don't know if you know this, but I started out as a novelist, right? I sort of came up through prose, and I occasionally get asked, usually while semi-inebriated, you know, what's it like doing both? And the funny thing is, whereas you could definitely draw some lines between the two different forms of writing, and people just sort of assume, well, they're both writing, they must be basically the same thing. That they're not. They utilize some of the same parts of the mind and the process, that the sort of pre-production process of dreaming, letting your imagination run wild,
Right.
and plotting and all of that stuff. That's broadly the same, but the process of sitting down to write is utterly different. And I used to describe it as being like the difference between being a mechanic or being an ambulance driver. You know, they both broadly revolve around a vehicle with four wheels, but that's about the end of it. You know, that's as much as you could say. Now, to extend that to your question, it's not quite the same. It's not quite true to say that writing work for hire stuff and writing creator owned stuff is that completely distinct, that they might as well be two different media, but it's not far off. The mentality, the formalism, the process, the stress, they come in very different amounts in those two different worlds. And um, working in a shared universe for one of the big two companies, especially, that uses no, that requires a level of discipline that I find very onerous. And it's not even like the discipline of getting things done on time. That's not the problem for me. I've never missed a deadline in my life. That's not an issue. The discipline comes from two steps back. When one goes into one of those projects, one has to find the thing that one loves, right? More often than not, an editor comes to you and says, "Hey, we've got a Black Knight project. Would you write a Black Knight project?" And I'm like, "Yeah, definitely. Who the fuck's the Black Knight? Never heard of that character." And then you go away and you do your homework, and if you're good at this, you find something about that character, that that situation, whatever it is that they're asking you to write, and you get excited about it. You allow yourself to enthuse to the extent that it's almost the same as writing a creator-owned project. Now, that involves an awful lot of self-deception, if I can be cruel about it, because you know I don't know about a lot of other writers. They seem to have been fans of all of these characters long before they became writers. I was not. I grew up in the UK, came to comics quite late. When I came to comics, it was like punky British 2000 AD stuff, and then gradually found my way across the Atlantic and come into a lot of these characters knowing less than I probably ought. So there's a real steep learning curve, lots of homework, lots of background reading, intensive necessity to find the thing about that character that thrills me. And that, unless you're very disciplined, and I'm not, that wears off really quickly, right? You go into it, they're saying to you, this is an ongoing series, and you've pitched for probably 6 or 12 issues, you've got this amazing idea, you've got this thing that makes you excited about the character, and then you get to the end of that arc and you're like, great, I've finished. And I've always been the sort of writer who loves an ending. I feel like a story doesn't really matter unless it's got an ending. and you're going, great, okay, so I've done my 12 issues. What character's next? What's my next challenge? And they're like, no, no, we assume you'd want to hang around and do another 12. And you're like, oh, okay, yeah, no, yeah, I've got loads of ideas. That's great. Yeah, I love this character. So that's what I mean by discipline. You have to keep
Sure.
finding the new thing and the new thing that excites you and interests you. And I find that quite exhausting. Whereas, by definition, if you're doing a create your own story, you wouldn't be bothering unless this was stuff that interested you. And more often than not, you go
Right.
into that idea knowing whether it needs to be an ongoing, and P.S. Therefore, you're going to spend the next 5 years of your life panicking because you can't maintain sales to make it worthwhile. Or, in my case, more often, it's a self-contained story because I love an ending. I don't often
Right.
plan a story unless I know exactly how it's going to end. Um, it's been said way too often, but I think it holds true. The sort of the two different disciplines are with creator owned comics. You start with something that you love, and your job is to try and persuade everybody else in the world to love it too. In work for hire, more often than not, you start with something that everybody else loves, and your job is to find the thing about it that you're going to love too. And that's chalk and cheese. They're broadly the same disciplines, but they couldn't be more different. They're sort of opposite ends of the creative spectrum. I have waffled. You promised me that you wouldn't let me waffle.
No, this is good. I look. I've got another question in mind. I'm wait. I can see you're getting there, and I'm waiting. I'm waiting for you to get there, and we're there. Well, okay. It's so funny though because you know, have you ever in any of your creator-owned stuff thought I would like to go back to that world, given that most everything that you've done has been a nice tight ending. But has there ever been one where you're like, oh, you know what, I could probably go back?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And they tend to be the projects that started with a sort of world building
Mm-hmm.
um, um, I don't know the right word. An effort, is that right? Because it is an effort. When you start with a project that needs world creation, that's something I get quite excited by, and it
Right.
invests a lot of my brain and a lot of my time in the process of not just coming up with what a cool world would look like, but like stuff that would sound quite boring if I wrote it down or tried to explain it. It comes to things like economies and societies, and when I say economies, I don't mean in terms of money. I mean in terms of what is the basic transactional process that allows people to rub shoulders in this
Mm-hmm.
particular world. That's stuff that you need to know and you need to bake into your world before you then push it to the back and you focus on the interesting stuff in the foreground, which is the characters and the story. Because in many cases I've spent an awful lot of time and energy and effort thinking about that, and I'm thinking here about things like The Spire or Coda or Angelic, Step by Bloody Step. These sort of projects that live or die depending upon the brilliance of the sort of visionary artists that I've been lucky enough to work with. You go into it all using the discipline I've just been talking about, which is to push the
Right.
world that you've just spent so long creating into the background so that it doesn't get in the way. This is a little bit of a sidebar, but I have a real bugbear with stories whose entire point is to threaten the world that has just been created. It's like
Mm.
there's this dumb through line from step A, I have just imagined a new world. Step B, therefore my story has to be about stakes that threaten this world. Zip, 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 adventure, 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 conflict, conflict, conflict. Step Z, the world is saved. Now, to me, that's just lazy. Like, you look at some of the great speculative fictions that we like. Blade Runner is the best example. Here's this amazingly realized world. None of the events that hold us spellbound threaten the world. And in fact, there's a
Mm.
good argument for the fact that nothing Deckard does actually changes anything in the entire story, which is
Right.
quite an exciting bit of storytelling in its own right. But um, for me, having created these worlds and then so judiciously chosen to push the world into the background to tell this particular story between these characters in this location, and to sort of wrap that all up, the temptation therefore is to say, well, the world's still there, and there are other characters in that world, so why wouldn't I revisit that world? And that's something that I'd love to do, something I've done once or twice. We did a sort of quasi sequel to Coda, Matthias and I. The really grim, pragmatic reason that one does not do that is simply because one can't guarantee that it'll sell very well. You know, that's the other realpolitik of the creator ownership brain, is that you're always thinking not just in terms of I want to create something beautiful and tell stories that thrill me and I hope they're going to thrill everybody else. You're also having to think, how the fuck am I going to sell this to people? Is anybody going to read this damn thing? And if I tell my 6 issues and then turn around and say I've got another 7 in me, are they going to keep buying it? So you know, these are really awful, often heartbreaking questions that you have to be very honest when answering.
You mentioned that you've been fortunate to work with such amazing collaborators. Given how you got your start in the business, and in the path to kind of where you are now, clearly you've worked with a ton of folks. But when it comes to doing your creator-owned work, what are things for you that you need to make sure you can find in a collaborator that makes a good collaborator for something that is yours versus, playing the blind dating game maybe that, you get when you're doing work for hire?
It's a really great question. It's a little different for every project, but in general, you can sort of divide it into 2 parts. The one part is to do with process. Ignore for a moment whether the artist is any good at their job. We'll come to that in a second. The process part is, do I get along with this person? Can we communicate with one another? Are they going to keep me abreast of surprises? Just simple stuff like that. The same that you would have to, if you were sitting in an office next to somebody in the next cubicle and they were a prick, you would want your cubicle moved, right? You wouldn't choose to sit next to that person. So all of that stuff is absolutely part and parcel of it. I've been very lucky in that on several occasions I've created these things that have been so satisfying to both myself and my main collaborator, the artist, that we keep coming back to work together again. And there's an interesting conversation to be had about the way that those relationships evolve over time, the way that collaborators begin to trust one another and preempt one another's decisions in a way that makes the creative juices flow a little bit more efficiently, and ultimately things end up being much greater than the sum of their parts. So that's very much on the table. When you then look at the other side of it, which is purely to do with what sort of artist do I want to make this project look amazing, I tend to, well, look, like I said before, I came up through novels, right? So hardbait to me is this sort of quite wordy, didactic approach to comics where and I shouldn't really admit this, but if I end up working with an artist that I really don't enjoy their work, and that's happened on a couple of occasions, always in work for hire context because you don't always get to choose, then I always have the out of just writing my way around it, right? You're not supposed to tell, you're supposed to show, but sometimes you've got to really tell because the artist isn't helping you to show. So when it comes to choosing with whom I work in creator-owned projects, my first and most important criterion is, can this person be additive? Can this person help me to not have to talk very much, to not have to describe very much? Can I tell my story in a buttoned-down way in which the art is telling one version of events and the words are telling a different version of events, and they're not tripping each other over? That's really my only criterion. And the test for this.
Do you have a preferred kind of script format? Like, I know it seems like a very kind of basic kind of thing, and usually the answer is, well, it depends on the artist. But some writers are like, nope, this is how I do it.
No, I always write full script. I think the only exception, and this goes back to what I was talking about earlier on, which is if you work with somebody often enough. In my case, I've worked with Matthias Bagara so
Right.
many times now that I know if often if there's a very busy page, I'll want to describe it all anyway, knowing that he'll go and make his changes and they'll always be better. So that's okay. I trust him to do that. If it's a very loose page with a couple of beats, I feel very comfortable just describing the beats and maybe talking about the outcomes. What we want readers to feel is this. The lines of dialogue probably look like this. You can put them wherever you like and just sort of let him go. So that's sort of a hybrid Marvel style versus full script. But that's a product of my little test, which is
Right.
if I receive in my inbox a piece of art, a page from the artist, if I can still remember, and P.S. my memory is appalling, right? And I have when writing a script, I have quite a visual imagination. But as soon
Okay.
as I've moved on from a script, I'm thinking about the next one. So here's this piece of art. It's arrived in my inbox. I'm looking at it. Hopefully, my jaw's on the floor. I'm delighted. If I can remember how this page looked inside my head when I wrote it, then the artist has failed.
Mm.
If this vision I'm staring at on my screen has totally eclipsed whatever fading memory I have of what I imagined, then the artist has succeeded. And I'm pleased to say, like 90% of the time, the artist has succeeded because, by
Mm.
definition, they're better at this shit than I am. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
so that's the test. If on those rare occasions the page arrives and you are so utterly in love with it that it changes everything, you think, I now have to up my game. I need to rewrite the dialogue. I'm going to change the way that I'm telling this story because the art is doing so much heavy lifting. Sometimes even lifting weights that I didn't realize needed to be picked up,
Mm.
or lifting weights that I hadn't intended to be picked up. And
Right.
all these things are possible with a visionary artist, that it makes you reactive in a way that, the usual
Right.
chain is the writer's the fucking fascist at the top and everybody else is the sort of poor little peasants who have to pick up the piece. That is not the case
Yeah.
when you work with a great artist, and that's
Right. Well,
creatively
I
wonderful.
don't mean to put you necessarily on the spot, though. I'd love. Do you happen to have an example, maybe, on like what changing dialogue in the script
Mm.
in a moment where you get a piece? What does that kind of look like?
Well,
Right.
I
Like,
mean, I'll
is it?
go on.
Oh, go ahead.
So, The Voiced Kill, which is the new book that we'll come to,
Yep.
working with Vanessa Del Rey for the first time, and that's a big risk for me. This is a
Right.
book that's been ticking away in my brain for 3 years. Vanessa's a known visionary artist who has such a distinctive style. This could have gone very horribly wrong. But in my head, right, so the script's already written. In my head, as I start looking for the right artist for this project, I've got this hard boiled, perfectly recursive story. It's like a beautiful diamond. Everything reflects on itself. I know exactly how it ends. I could give this story to the most middle of the road, mundane artist imaginable, and maybe people would read it and enjoy the story, but you probably wouldn't get many comments about the art. So, what has actually happened is Vanessa has come to it and said, this is a great story, now let's add something to it. And what she's added to it is pure, feverish, impressionistic, psychedelic. I mean, so many adjectives I could throw at this, but the point is, you can feel it in a way that I didn't
Right.
expect to feel. Suddenly, I'm seeing pages which I expected to be very clean and very orderly, and instead, I'm like, this is making me sweat, and I can hear grasshoppers and birds shrieking in the trees, and I can feel alligator eyes peering at me, and that's her
Mm.
magic. And when you have that level of like sensory synesthetic brilliance taking you through what could have been a very conventional, still good, I think, but very conventional crime
Right.
story, it makes you go back and say, okay, so I don't need that character to say that anymore because that's no longer important. What's important is the
Mm.
mood, the tone. That thing gets explained away by this panel. Counterintuitively, also, if Vanessa is so focused on the feeling, Sometimes I have to do the opposite. I have to have somebody say, "Oh, I seem to have picked up a bottle," things like that. So you just have to
Right.
be really reactive to it, and it ends up being so much greater than the sum of its parts, and so much better than I imagined it could have been. And I think that's the magic of comics. Like, as I said
Mm.
before, coming from novels, I sort of have this slightly lonely, creative, ennui infused thing where the writer sits at his desk creating his masterpiece, and oh, he's so sad and nobody understands him, and maybe one day his opus will emerge into the market and probably nobody will read it. And in comics, that's just not an option. You have to be able to
Yeah.
communicate with people, and if you don't, if you take the "I'm the maestro and they must do what I tell them" approach, the art is going to be bad. The comic is going to be bad. If you trust, and I'm very bad at trust, but if you trust, then you get great work.
Sure. Okay. So on the topic of trust, I want to take a step back
Mm-hmm.
and talk about the work that you've done with Matthias. We have to talk about Step by Bloody
Mm-hmm.
Step for a little bit, and then we'll get right to it. It's so interesting to hear you talk about your background as a novelist and how important things like dialogue can be for you in certain things. And here you are in this book telling something so extremely silent, but like emotionally deafening, right? Like that had to have been that feels like a climbing Mount Everest kind of thing for you, in that putting this book together and doing it in the way that you've done. Uh, what kind of what new muscles did you find yourself flexing for this that then has helped that has then helped you
Mm.
maybe kind of after, because so very few people I think can get can accomplish something like what you've done there, and one, not drive themselves completely mad, but two, come out on the other side of it also even better.
I mean, cliche time. It was a learning experience. It really was. And partly because neither of us had ever read a book like that, not a satisfying way, that
Uh-huh.
while putting it together, we were as much readers having to talk about our critical responses to what we had created as we were creators. Um, the irony is not lost on me that I'm best known for being quite a wordy writer who sort of enjoys playing with language and
Yeah.
creating new sort of idioms and all the rest of it, and yet,
I tell folks all the time, your dialogue is some of
well,
the
that's really
best
kind of you, and
in comics that I
it's
read.
worth.
Yeah.
The hilarious thing is that I was writing Step by Bloody Step and Hellblazer at the same time, so I was sort of scratching both ends of
Right.
the dog. But it was simultaneously very very difficult but very liberating. I could not have done it if I didn't have Matthias and have utter
Mm.
trust in Matthias. Um, Oddly enough, even though it was very difficult to plan and to plot, the writing process was incredibly fast.
Mm.
Not only because there was no sitting around
Of
writing
course not.
dialogue, sitting
Right.
here at my desk doing silly voices, driving my wife mad like I normally do, all of that stuff, but because you are operating on a level of instinct. And this is where, like, let's flip it back to the point of looking at a book like that from the reader's perspective. What we quite quickly realized is that the brain consumes um, text-free imagery in a slightly different way. It's really easy to use the word silent, but then that sort of is this beautiful, magical way of forgetting that all comics are silent because no comic talks, right? So the magic of dialogue in comics is that it's making your brain substitute the the data received by your eyes with imagined data going into your ears, right? So we just chop that off completely. Um, what the brain does, we think, when you read a normal comic, i.e., one that's got speech balloons in it, is that the eye jumps into a new panel, goes straight to the speech balloons, reads through the text, and then pauses to make sure that whatever visual is going on around it corresponds, confirms, juxtaposes, whatever it may be. So this is the magical dance between received information and perceived information, which makes comics so unique. When there is no recognizable dialogue to anchor the eye, to arrest the eye, instead each panel, doesn't matter whether it's a whole pager or a tiny little panel, each panel becomes a little investigation. The reader's eye has to stop and think, why is the artist showing me this? Is it just for tone? Is it just for mood? Or am I being shown something that matters to the plot? And that achieves two things when that becomes the basic reading process. Number one is that it means the reader is unconsciously having to work quite hard. Now, I believe you get out of a story what you put into it. It's this sort of unconscious transaction. So the harder you're working on an unconscious level, the deeper the beats will hit you, the more emotionally resonant things feel. So that's great. That's working in our advantage.
Right. No, this is definitely a book that you need to sit in, be ready to read it. This is not a bring it to the beach.
It's oddly enough,
not a beach read.
The strange thing about Step by Bloody Step is that for a book with no dialogue, people often tell me it took them longer to read than a book and that's great. You know, I'm all about money, value for money. But the second outcome is that it's exhausting. You're mentally tired quite quickly because every little panel is an investigation. So we quite quickly realized that the way to get around that, or the way to reward that, is to occasionally provide the readers with a big, beautiful, silent moment. So you'll turn the page and there'll be a double page splash of just the world, you know, snow or an incredible landscape of mountains and strange technology. And it has the effect of making the reader go, ah, I can pause, I can breathe. And then you're on to the next thing. And I think that's the sort of thing that as creators we need to be aware of. We need to sort of tend to our readers' mental health along the way, because I think it rewards you ultimately. I think you would have lost quite a lot of readers otherwise, just because nobody knows what to do with a silent story. So we're crazy proud of that, and our next project, if it ever gets off the ground, is a sort of complete reversal of that, where we try to find a way to organically treat text as if it were a visual design element. So let's not go there right now. That's still to come. But the point is, Matthias is the sort of person.
Well, no. So, but does that? But like, so then, like, having moved past that, do you feel that maybe that experience has taught you or shown you the ability of restraint in a sense when it comes to dialogue?
I think like all things in their right place, you know, there are books that it's right to enjoy the use of language, if only because you can use it to your advantage. Like, you know, writing Hellblazer or Damn Them All, if you have these characters who talk a lot and you have lots of narrative heavy text, then turning a page and being met with a sudden silence can be devastating. So, you know, you can toy with it in those ways. When it comes to the sort of big two stuff, I think I have to be a little bit cautious here, because I also have a sort of probably unfair pub rant notion that the mainstream reader has been hoodwinked into the belief that the kind of quick read, very low panel count, very small amounts of dialogue, that equates to this buzzword du jour of confidence. Oh, it's such a confident comic. What that means to me is it took you 30 seconds to read and you've wasted $5. So, you know, there's like a balancing act. I need to be able to feel like readers are getting their teeth into something toothsome, but also, it taught us to recognize that there are times when silence is more deafening than an awful lot of words.
Right, makes sense. All right, let's jump to the voice segment. This, I'm gonna let you kind of do the elevator pitch for the book, and then we will, which I know you're well
Oh
practiced
God,
by this
I
point.
wish I was better at that.
and then we'll get a little deeper for it.
Yeah. So the voice to kill. I've after so no surprise, spending a lot of time trying very hard to market this book. So I've gone from 3,000 words of what the book's about down to the sort of awful reductive nugget. What I've come to is psychedelic swamp noir. How's that? Psychedelic swamp noir.
There we go.
It's a book about a wildlife park ranger. She's heavily pregnant. She's in the Louisiana bayou. Her entire team has been sent home with what appears to be food poisoning. She wants just a quiet day because she's 8 months pregnant. She shouldn't really be at work anymore anyway. And then things just start going wrong, and it begins with news of a potentially dangerous guy with a gun romping around in the bayou on his own. He's off his meds. His mother is the leader of the local sort of alligator ranch slash underworld family. And from there, things just spiral out of control. So it's this crime thriller. It speaks to motherhood. It speaks to murder. It speaks to mobsters. It speaks to moonshine and magic mushrooms. The best comps I've heard from somebody else were that it's like Fargo meets True Detective season 1 by way of Apocalypse Now. And that last slightly unexpected comp is because a large part of the story is a walk into the wilderness.
Sure.
And that's sort of like we talked before about what happens when you have this story which could be quite buttoned down, and then you start introducing these very lavish psychedelic images and visuals, and that's where Vanessa comes into her own. You start to feel
Right.
this tonal dichotomy between the sort of civilized illusion that these people live in. We think that we've tamed the wild, and then we have to go into the wild, and we realize that actually we've barely scratched the surface. So there's a lot going on, but yeah, it's sort of good, very tense, very human, horror tones, occasionally funny. Couldn't be prouder of it.
Right. So, with something like that, though, how do you kind of maintain the balance between, the gritty crime realism aspect of this, but also with the, very trippy, hallucinogenic, kind of a undercurrent you've got there? What is that tightrope like for you?
I think to an extent I have abdicated that question entirely. Do you know what I mean? Like as I was waffling before, the story works with either of those.
Sure.
You could write it in a novel. You could be staring at the most middle of the road art, and it would hang together. The story's that tight, and I'm so completely proud of it. But why not then add an extra layer? Why not say this is a good enough story on its own that it can also become infused with this psychedelic this psychedelic aesthetic, and like I said before, one ends up informing the other. There's like a beautiful twist 3/4 of the way through this story that I don't want to spoil, but it's that sort of story where there's a whole ton of twists and turns towards the end, and the ending is this delightfully Tarantino-esque Grand Guignol sort of thing. But the twist that I'm talking about would not have come about if it hadn't occurred to me quite early on in the day that we'd gone from buttoned down noir crime to something much more psychedelic and visionary, and that's how brilliant the collaboration can be.
Right. It's having read the first issue, and loving it, all bias aside, I love stories where the environment is a character, right? Like, and so it's so very clear of that. And so, And I have to imagine this is like, right, like this is the part that Vanessa really does bring to the table, like the swampy, muggy nature. Like you can feel it
Yep.
in reading the book.
Yeah, yeah. It speaks to character as well. Sorry to cut in. Like
No, you're fine.
without this being a sort of key element of the story, it's very much subtext, and without this being something that I go running off with, because I will waffle for hours about this. It's another bloody pub rant. But I'm pretty sure that if you were able to distill the American psyche down to a very cruel generalization, and just to be very clear, I'm talking about the white American psyche. It has something to do with standing tall against the wild. It has something to do with one man striding out across the wilderness, taming the wild, making the world his playground. That being the case, it was critical, for reasons that become clear over the course of the story, that our central character not be white, first of all, belong to a community which is impoverished, belong to a community which is somewhat othered. The fact that she is about to become a mother for the first time speaks to a whole second layer of anxieties to do with responsibility. It's no coincidence I was writing this at the same time that my little girl was born. I spent a bit of time in the bayou myself, just sort of stopping and sitting and feeling. And it all
Well, so that's what I was going to
Oh
ask.
yeah, no,
Right,
we
like why the
take
Louisiana
our
of it
take
all?
our homework quite seriously around here. Yeah, like and funnily enough, the even more influential time. I spent some time in the jungle in Bolivia, and like promised myself I was never going to become somebody who kept diaries, and within days was filling pages with. It's something to do with the sort of teeming um, surrender to chaos. You cannot survive in these environments if you think you're in charge. You're not, and you
Yeah.
can't. What you have to do is accept that you are a small cog in a very big machine, and what the machine's entire purpose is for life to feed upon life. Nothing in these wildernesses exists except by the death of something else, and that's true of anything that eats other things, but also anything that doesn't eat anything that's alive in the animalistic sense. So it's this extraordinary recycling. I hate to even use the word machine because it isn't. It's the opposite of a machine. But you get my point. It's this
Right.
churning place of pure beautiful chaos. And Marie, our central character, understands that in a way that none of the other characters in our story do. Precisely because she is who she is, because she is pregnant, because she grew up in this place, because she has ideas about how appallingly absurd it is that we humans are in the habit of giving other humans the power of judgment and life or death decisions over each other. She hates that whole idea. She hates that people think she's a cop. She's not a cop. And all of that, it just kind of accreted. Like, this is only the second story I've ever made where the whole thing just occurred to me in one big go. Kaboom. Normally,
Sure.
it's this sort of layered approach where things wrap around each other and form over weeks and weeks. This just arrived all in one go, and when that happens, it happens because the character has to be like this, and the story has to be like this, and it has to be set somewhere like that. And so it all just sort of figured itself out to the extent that,
Mm-hmm.
as you can tell, I struggle to explain some of the logic behind these things. All I know is that if she were a different person in a different part of the world, the whole thing would not hold together the way it holds together.
Right. So then, what are you hoping fans get out of this? What are you trying to make them feel, understand, or what are you hoping they take away?
On every level, I'm hoping that it's a really great, satisfying crime story that makes people thrilled and gives people a little glimpse into a world that they may not be familiar with. On a more thematic level, I hope that it moves people. I hope that people um, resonate with Marie's central dilemma, which is how I mean, it sounds so absurdly simple, but how are you a good person in this world? How do you show that you are walking a righteous path through this garden we have inherited? How do you look your unborn child in the eye when it arrives and say, I made the right choices? And sidebar, the whole story derives from the fact that very early on in the first issue, Marie does something awful for the right reasons, without thought, it's purely instinctive, and then instantly makes a choice about how to deal with it. And that choice is the thing that causes everything else to spiral. So all of this, and then on a slightly wanky formalist note, I hope that people pick this up and think, I didn't realize that comics could be so versatile, so eccentric, so eclectic. I didn't realize that within the space of a couple of pages, a comic could go from this loose, impressionistic, almost sketch-like quality, which perfectly suits that scene, to something far more rendered and overwrought and chaotic and claustrophobic. And again, I'm singing the praises of the artist all through, because it makes such a difference to be elevating a great story to something that is also synesthetically and sensorially rewarding, and just sort of really dynamic. Yeah, it's a real privilege to have been part of that. So I hope that's what people get out of it. And small
So
things.
was there a page or a scene that, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but that you like got back from Vanessa that just hit you, maybe not necessarily in a creatively in a way where like, oh, I need to change this, but like more hit you emotionally, given that it seems like so much of the atmosphere and all of this comes from your fairly lived experience, right? Spending time in the bayou, spending time in the jungle.
Yeah, I
What,
mean,
what, what,
yes,
where did she hit you?
two pages leap out. One is literally the first couple of pages in the first issue, because I couldn't, until I saw them, imagine how this artist with whom I had never worked before was going to render the deep, deep forest, which is a place that you sort of have to go before you really understand what that feels like to be there. And she just captured it so perfectly. It's just so resonant and so, like I said before, like you feel the sweat prickling, and you sort of, you can smell it, you can hear the Spanish moss moving in the trees, all of that stuff. Little water birds scampering in the weeds that you can't see but you know they're there. All of that stuff, it's there in these first few pages of pure chaos. And then there's another one that sticks out. It's in issue 2 actually. There's a sort of slow motion chase sequence where this heavily pregnant woman has to rush down 3 flights of stairs on the outside of a low rent motel while she's being pursued by some proper wrong'uns from the top floor. And Vanessa's it's like one of the best compositionally dynamic pages I've seen in comics, and that's no small thing to say, because a page arrangement is as much of an art as the art itself. But it's this stunning DeLuca effect vibe where the stairs crisscross the page, they perfectly move your eye down the page. That leapt out. And then there's a third one which hasn't happened yet. There's a beat in the third issue where all of the under-bubbling psychedelic slash sacred ideas that have been sort of haunting things on the outskirts, all of them come together in a moment. Marie sees something in the forest. And yeah, I can't wait to see how Vanessa draws it, because it's a moment that it almost took my breath away when I was writing it. So yeah, that's a little tease there, but I think she's gonna nail it.
To bring this kind of full circle, right, and to kind of start all the way back at the beginning. What were some of those early conversations with Vanessa like? Right, like you have said that this is a story that you've been holding on to for quite some time. You needed to make sure you wanted to find the right collaborator to do this with, and so obviously, you know, how did you find her, right? But two, you said you sent her the script. She said she loved it. But where do some of those early conversations go from there?
It's a long time ago, so my memory is, as discussed, pretty imperfect.
Right.
But I think I made contact by, I mean, one of the most key things about being a creator-owned creator is that you have to have communication with others. You know, we're back to the sad, lonely writer at his desk a little bit, but it's also just that in comics in general, creator-owned or work for hire, opportunities and support come about exclusively as a result of networks. You create networks by not being a prick. It's that simple. And you know, there's an awful lot of pricks who think that they're sitting at the top of a tree while the rest of the network's like, let's start a new network, shall we? And they get found out very quickly, and they fall from grace quite spectacularly. You see it occasionally. No, you just have to surround yourself with people whose work you love, and you have to be interested as well as interesting. And that being the case, you can then go to your peers. I hate that word, but you can go to your peers and say, I've got this great story. A, does anybody want to read it and tell me what they think of it? And B, can you recommend any artists who'd be good for this? And that's how I came to Vanessa, because we'd never had any contact before that. I sent her the script. She's always obscenely busy. She's one of those artists who's juggling multiple things, working on several things at once. Clearly, she saw something in that script. Like, to reiterate, I am a very wordy scriptist. So my first description of those first few pages in the bayou are quite adjective heavy. So I hope she felt invested somehow in this scene to the extent that it inspired her. And then within a week or two, I started receiving these beautiful little character sketches, just like a couple of inches high, a few lines scribbled with a bit of color. And that's her genius, is that she uses we're back to you know, discipline and the idea that less can be more. She can do a few little lines, wibbledy wibbledy woo, and it's a person. And oh shit, that's not just a person, that's the character who I wrote about, who I couldn't quite get right in my head. She just captures the personalities really quickly. So it rolled from there. It rolled very slowly from there. But we're here now.
Well, I think we have brought this entire conversation. We brought it home. We landed the plane, full circle, waffling and all.
Yes, forgive me.
No, that's it. Look, depending on when you are listening to this, The Voice Said Kill is out in July of 2025. If it's you're listening to this after that, well, go pick it up. If you are listening to this before July 23rd, go tell your retailer you need at least 3 copies. One for yourself, one to keep in another room to just pick up and continue to read, and then the third to give to somebody else.
Actually,
those are my rules.
That's a good way of sliding in that we have some amazing variants in issue 1. We've got Christian Ward variant and we've got a Tula Lote variant for issue 1, and they are both very beautiful. So you really can treat yourself to 3 issues.
See? Exactly. Perfect. Awesome. Si, this has been an absolute blast. I appreciate you taking the time to kind of walk us through your process, the new book, and all that. So appreciate it.
Well, I've really enjoyed myself. Thank you for having me.
And that's going to do it for another episode of Let's Talk Comics. Huge thank you to Si Spurrier for jumping on. It's always cool to hear how someone like him kind of thinks through the work and what it's like to build these worlds and just completely kind of trust the process, you know, even when it gets messy. So if you haven't already gone to your local comic book shop and pre-ordered The Voice Said Kill, like I said at the end, go do that. Like, don't not read this one. Don't not pick this one up. You're going to want to read it. I promise you. If you're listening to this after the book has come out, go find a copy, go find the trade or whatever. Trust me, this is going to be a book that sticks with you. It's not, God, I didn't want to make like it's going to stick with you because it's in the bayou and it's sweaty and, and all that. But I'm going to make that connection. I'm going to make that joke, whatever. I did it. It's my show. But like the book it's surreal. It's emotional. It's the exact kind of book that reminds you what comics can do when no one is trying to play it safe. The art is gorgeous. The story hits. And you're not ready, I promise you, for where it goes. So grab it at your local comic shop. Get all 3 covers. And, if you're like me, pretend one is for the shelf and then give one away to someone, like I said. If you liked the episode, subscribe, leave a review, share it with a friend that talks way too much about panel composition, and tag us. Like I said, social is another great way. I said I would read some reviews, and that's where I am going to do that. These first couple are from Apple Podcasts, which I appreciate. One is from Bear7. Love that you guys are still keeping comics alive. Great podcast. Keep up the good work. Hey, thank you, man. I appreciate it. This one headlined, Let's Talk from Juzzles. I'm a wannabe comic illustrator, and I'm currently in the process of trying to launch issue 1 of my own comic. This show is wonderfully inspiring to people like me who lack the knowledge to walk in the best direction to creating. I understand that it isn't the main purpose of this show, but unfortunately is so incredibly thorough in the interviews with these creators that I can't help but teach and inspire. I love talking comics and getting creative insider info, but also walk someone through another one's career in making comics is such a wonderful learning experience. I thank Jim for making this podcast happen and unintentionally inspiring me to work harder and reach higher for my dream. Honestly, thank you isn't enough. I wished I could subscribe twice. Well, look, you can subscribe on iTunes, then subscribe on Spotify. That can help. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate that. That's really kind of you. From Walt Shipman, he's right. This is my new favorite comics podcast. I told you it would be. I did tell you. This one's from who is this one from? Matthias LT. A masterclass in comics disguised as conversation. Oh, I love that one. That one makes me feel good. As someone who always loved comic books but recently started exploring the idea of creating my own graphic novel, Let's Talk Comics has been an absolute game changer. Every episode feels like a breath of fresh air, part deep dive interview, part casual conversation among people who live and breathe the medium. Jim does an incredible job pulling back the curtain on the creative process. It's not just a Q&A, it's storytelling about storytelling. Ooh, I may steal that as my new intro. The guests open up in a way that feels honest and unfiltered, sharing not only their work, but how they think, create, and evolve. Since discovering the podcast, I've made it a point to read at least one series from every creator featured. It's become a ritual. Listen, get inspired, dive into their work. Each episode leaves me not just entertained, but genuinely motivated to keep working on my own ideas. I've recently discovered some incredible series thanks to the show. That Texas Blood by Chris Condon hooked me with its slow burn noir storytelling. The Silver Coin by Michael Walsh is horror at its finest. Ultimate Wolverine and The Ultimates by Denise Camp is a fascinating twist. And Bug Wars, Radiant Black, We're Taking Everyone Down With Us are now all on my must-read list. Oh, I love that. So whether you're a longtime fan or an aspiring creator, this podcast isn't just worth your time. It might just change the way you think about comics. Wow, what a thoughtful review. Thank you so much, man. This last one on Apple Podcasts is from Number One about our Dennis Camp interview. Excellent interview with a creator whose work I've dissected in recent months, only to find out that he's also dissected the young masters of his day. Checked out an issue of Ice Cream Man off the strength of the recommendation, and as I shared in the bittersweet and unfortunately melty joy, I realized Camp wrote a page in the same issue as Grant Morrison. So happy to see further and further heights reach base camp to base camp as Dennis climbs Comics Mountain. And shout out to the teams behind all these books in the run that he's been on, from Javier Rodriguez to Eric Zawodowski, to Stefan Morian to Juan Figueri, and letterers and colorists too, like Jordi Belair and Hassan. It feels like I discover a new legend every time I pick up one of these books. Fingers crossed for another Stefan collaboration. Love it. Thank you guys so much. I'm gonna do it. Stop there. I'm gonna read some Spotify ones next week, or for not next week, but the next one, because we've already gone on long enough, and this just feels like me patting myself on the back, and it's not. It's one of those things where I've gotten so much great feedback on the show, and I love that people are connecting with it in a way that the show intends to hopefully connect with folks. So thank you. That's more. I just wanted to give a shout out to the people who have taken the time to do that, because it just means the world to me. All right, enough yammering. You know what to do. Head on over to your local comic book shop, pick up some new comics, read some new comics, because as long as you keep doing that, we're going to keep talking about them. I'll catch you later.